Firstly, I just want to say thank you so much for coming today, and thank you very much for having me. Before I sort of properly get started, I just want to sort of say a proper thank you to all the organisers of this conference, including all the behind the scenes tech support. A lot of labour goes into events like these, and much of it I can imagine is unpaid. So even if we don't sort of see all of it, it is the reason that we are all here today able to have these discussions. So thank you very much to everyone who's sort of been involved in putting this on. And so, as has already been said, the theme of this conference is thinking about place and how it relates to refugee mental health. So what I want to do today is think about this in relation to Britain, and what we might call Britain's sort of hostile environment. And so, as Hannah said, the title of my talk is The Roots and Impacts of the Hostile Environment in Britain, Racism, Discrimination and Disposability. So this sort of might give you some idea of some of the ground that I'm going to cover, but essentially what I want to do today is, what I'm hoping to do is to think about how we got to this point. So some of the things that Hannah described in terms of the processes that people seeking asylum are exposed to or put through, and the forms of, in a lot of ways, the forms of state violence that happens and that creates severe mental distress amongst a lot of people. How did we even get to this point? How did we get to this point where there is a sort of hostile environment in Britain? And more broadly, I want to think about this policy regime that vulnerabilizes people seeking asylum and people who attempt to move to Britain. So in the sort of work that I do, that means, I think, considering some of the ways that populations are racialized and made disposable. And I think in this talk, I'm going to try and argue that these processes around racialization and disposability and vulnerability are some of the defining features of the social determinants of refugee mental health. Or put another way, I don't just want to describe the recent history of Britain's asylum system and its impacts, including the impact on people's mental health. I also want to try and think about how this is made possible. So that includes covering some of the historical processes that led to this point. So whilst I know that this is a conference that is specifically about refugee mental health, in a lot of ways, I'm going to try and take a step back to hopefully explain what I think is necessary context for having some of these discussions, including why we should be mindful of the role that race plays, and also to some extent, I'll touch a bit, although not enough, on gender. And I think this means necessarily giving an overview of some of the key themes and specifically focusing on this one case, Britain. So while not all of these arguments might neatly map onto discussions later in the day or work that many of you are conducting, I hope they're going to open up some useful avenues for discussion and debate. And I should also say that I am, I suppose, focused in some ways on one side of the debate, thinking about the negative impacts of policies and processes. So I do also realise that I am somewhat overlooking the other side of the picture, thinking about the forms of support that people create and create for themselves and in communities. And one other small note, just before I begin properly, and then I will get into it, is I'm gonna pay specific attention to people seeking asylum, but because of the work that I do, I'm also going to be speaking about immigration law and immigration processes more generally, because I think, as will become apparent towards the end of this talk, I also think that we should question the labelling that occurs more generally in immigration policy. So whilst we might today be specifically focused on thinking about asylum, obviously the way people's movement, the reasons people move, is far more messy than these categories allow for. And I think we need to sort of think about other populations that are made disposable in certain ways. So this is the structure of the talk. So I've set out broadly what I'm going to be doing, and this is how I'm going to be doing it. So I want to start briefly thinking about how I'm going to, the different ways I'm going to understand place. Then I'm going to think about the current situation for many people trying to secure status in Britain. But as I mentioned, I want to then take a step back and consider how this is possible. So situating this in a broader historical context, thinking about how race was bound up with immigration and asylum law. And here I'm also going to explore very briefly some of the ways we might understand race. My work predominantly, I don't just work on immigration, I work on processes of racialization in Britain more generally. So I want to think a bit about what do we mean when we're talking about race. And then I'm going to offer some reflections about what this might tell us about current asylum policy and discourse. So a brief bit on thinking about channel crossings and the Rwanda policy, before ending with what I suppose is about a warning about processes of labelling in the immigration debate, why we should broaden out beyond asylum. So to get started, when we're thinking about place, I think we can talk about this in a number of different ways. And these are just some of the ways. They're the ways that I'm going to be thinking about it, I guess, in the next half an hour. I'm going to think about the place in which I sit, so the sort of geographic entity that is Britain. And this might seem perhaps a bit obvious, but I think this matters because it is a place where people settle, they interact with authorities, where they spend their time. And I'm going to argue that this must include considering the ways that Britain is constituted as a place on the grounds of race, which includes thinking about the historical roots of, say, Britishness, and importantly, the connections beyond what is now considered to be Britain, how those connections are constitutive of this place materially and socially. But thinking about place also means analysing the place of the hostile environment in Britain's history of immigration policies, that broader context that I mentioned. It also means thinking about the place of refugees in Britain, which can both be understood as the physical place that refugees end up or are put in, and also the place that they have occupied in the British imaginary, how that might shift and change over time. But also related to this, I want to think a tiny bit about the place of different groups in the hierarchical ordering of movement and labelling, who is put out of place, if you like, at different times. So all of these ideas about place, they interact and overlap with one another, and I think in complex but quite important ways. And I would also say, obviously, this is not sort of an exhaustive list of the way that we can think about, or analysis of the way that we can think about place, but just some of the themes that were relevant to the kind of work that I do and the theme of this conference. So if we're thinking about place in relation to refugee mental health, I think one of the best ways, or one of the most obvious perhaps ways to start thinking about this, is how people seeking asylum are vulnerabilized through ideas of place, or through their literal place in the world. And so, because I'm sure a lot of you are aware, people, I'm using this word vulnerabilized, people are not inherently vulnerable, they are vulnerabilized through processes of things like state processes around bordering. And so now I know throughout the day, many of you are going to talk about these issues with greater specificity, but I think we can broadly say there are a number of different stages in which these people are vulnerabilized through place. So we could think about externalized border regimes that make it very difficult for people to get to countries like Britain. We can obviously think about the places that people are leaving in the first place, the sort of place in terms of the routes of travel that people have to take, and the ways that those routes of travel are shaped by different processes of bordering. We might also think about people being detained upon arrival. They might be sent, or they may be sent to an area through dispersal policies, to a place in which they feel out of place. They may be subject to constant monitoring, including having to go to reporting centres, made to stay in a particular place in a particular way. And then there is obviously also, as I mentioned, this sort of these other processes that can impact people, thinking about people being denied the opportunity to work, what that means for their sense of place, and in terms of that feeling valued, place in society, and their broader place in society in terms of hostile debate and treatment. And with all of this, people's sense of self and sense of place can be significantly damaged, including through an awareness of their own place within social hierarchies, where they are put, how they are treated. And obviously people resist these processes all the time in important ways, but that doesn't mean that these processes don't still exist. And the reason I say that is, during the research for my book, I met countless people who described the impacts of these policies. One person who was trying to claim asylum in Britain, who I'll call Diana, described how she felt about these policies. And this is a quote from her. She says, she said, "It's actually designed to isolate you, to bring you down, to make you want to give up. And pack your bags and just go. People really have to own their situation, because you can't rely on somebody else. You have to know your rights, and without that, you're headed to downfall. I'm not really a bad person, but you, Britain, have treated me so badly for just wanting to live a life here." So here we can see Diana describes being isolated, being made to feel alone, without a place or out of place. And I think it's really important to say, and this really came through in all the discussions that I have, the people that took the time to speak to me, is that these people, like people who are navigating these processes, as I'm sure many of you are aware, are not just simply passive victims of the immigration regime, but actually describe it in such a way that they are trying to resist it. People understand what they're being exposed to, and they are trying in all kinds of ways to resist the ways that the state and these practices and policies are sort of shaping their lives. So another person who's seeking asylum in Britain, who I have called Kelly, described the system too. She said, they're really brutal the way they treat people. I feel like they treat me like some kind of alien. There is no sympathy or any form of understanding. They have to look at everyone as an individual, not just you're a migrant, get out. So again, this out of placeness is evident. And in both cases, both people described the serious impact of these policies and the way they were made to feel in relation to their mental health. And obviously they were talking to me about their status, but it's sort of important to know that they're obviously much more than that. People obviously have rich lives beyond their trying to navigate their refugee status, but these processes can chip away at the ways that people feel in their communities, the way that they connect to others. So I would argue that there's a layering process in the asylum system whereby people are continually exposed to harm at different stages in their attempt to apply for asylum. So this occurs not only through overt bordering and bureaucratic processes, but also in the structures of the debates that play a role in shaping how people are treated. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. So if that's sort of the current terrain, how might we understand all of this, make sense of it? And so in order to make sense of how we got here, I think we can look at and think about Britain's hostile environment. And I argue that we can conceive of the hostile environment in two overlapping ways. So the first is a set of policies, both administrative and legal measures, brought in predominantly through the 2014 and 2016 Immigration Act. I'm sure you're all very aware of what this is. They do things like stopping people from being able to access healthcare, housing, work, without showing that you have the legal right to be in the UK. And this set of policies has intensified monitoring and fear, meant more data sharing and surveillance. And this has had a real impact on people, how safe or not they feel, and what they are able to access. It does exactly what it sounds like it would, which is inject more hostility into the system. And this has very, very severe impacts. So it causes a lot of mental distress amongst people who are exposed to the hostile environment, and particularly so during the pandemic. So some of the research that I did during the height of one of the lockdowns was speaking to people about how they were being impacted by ongoing immigration enforcement. I spoke to people who were too scared to go to their local GP or the hospital in the middle of a global health crisis because of the hostile environment policies. And so although the government made a number of announcements, including things like people wouldn't be charged if they went to be tested for COVID, but if you didn't test positive for COVID, that you were then sort of, as I understand it, then exposed to certain immigration policies. But they did this in a very ad hoc way with messages on their website, and making it very hard to follow, very, very unclear. I spoke to lawyers who were sort of struggling to track all the changes in immigration law, the tweaks that they were making during this time. And so essentially what we had was the government telling everyone that they should be able to go, that healthcare was really important, that we were all sort of in this together. And then their own policies meant people were differentially impacted in terms of what they could access and how. And so they'd spent years injecting hostility into the system, and they simply didn't reverse that, as I'm sure we all know. And I think this really shows a very clear commitment to projecting hostility in a very clear, consistent and pervasive way. And then the intended outcomes of that being mental distress, forcing people to leave. And in these moments of so-called crisis, that there wasn't, people were differentially exposed, I think, to the virus because of their status. But the point, I suppose, if we're thinking about, I said thinking about the hostile environment in two different ways, we have this one like specific way, which I think quite a lot of people are well versed in. But there's another way of thinking about it, because this point was not arrived at overnight. So there is a much longer term context in which this was produced. So, I've got some examples here from New Labour. We know in the 13 years prior to the hostile environment that there were lots of other policies that were exposing specifically people seeking asylum to all kinds of harm. And so many of the policies that I mentioned before were introduced or intensified under the New Labour government. So for example, it was New Labour that meant that people who were seeking asylum were denied the right to work, and people who applied for asylum in country, their access to support was limited to those who could prove they'd submitted their application as soon as reasonably practicable. So it was in this hostile system, according to some reports, in towards the end of New Labour's time in office, the numbers of refused people seeking asylum and refugees who were destitute doubled, and the number of people forced to sleep rough significantly increased. So we sort of have this what I think is sort of a shift, intensifying of quite hostile immigration and specifically asylum practices. But if we're thinking about that, it's not just, you know, the government prior to the coalition and then the Conservatives. I think we need to think about the more historical roots of such policies. So this is not simply a case. I think this I think is a very important point. This is not simply a case. These policies are not a case of governments responding to people's natural dislike for immigration or asylum. That's often the argument that's made, that X government brings in this X, Y, or Z law because the public dislikes immigration and asylum. They're worried about the numbers of people coming into the country. It's necessary for government to respond. So it's essentially assumed that when too many people of a certain kind come into a country like Britain, politicians have to act. But so one of the cruxes of my argument in the book and today is that anti-immigration and asylum feeling are constructed. They are not natural. And so the distress caused by these policies are not simply a necessary evil or an unfortunate byproduct of necessary measures. They're intentional, and they are bound up with how asylum and immigration is constructed. So this is one of the reasons that I argue it's necessary to look at the roots of contemporary immigration and asylum policy. So I don't have loads of time, so I'm not going to go into massive detail, and maybe I also don't, maybe a lot of you are already familiar with some of the sort of this historical context, but just to give a bit of a potted history, as I'm sure you are all aware, people from the colonies and former colonies had a right to move to Britain as citizens and subjects. But what we had is from 1962 onwards, successive pieces of legislation being introduced to make it more difficult for people to migrate to the UK. And obviously there is also a longer history of this that I think is really important to recognise. And there's an even longer history than that. But if you look at the early 1900s, what you see is immigration law being introduced in part to specifically keep out people who are poorer and people who are Jewish. And so if you think about things like, there's a very good line in the book by Louise London, very good but depressing line, which is about the kinder transport. We often talk about that as this positive moment in British history, but it's very telling that only the children came, not the parents, because the British state didn't want that. And so we have to also look at the anti-Semitism that is bound up with some of that immigration policy in the early 1900s. But if we look at this period from the 1960s onwards, which I think is also crucial to understanding how race and immigration work together in complex ways, is from 1962, you have the introduction of these successive policies, as I've said. But even before that, in the period between 1948 and 1962, Labour and Conservative governments tried to make movement more difficult through all kinds of clandestine measures. So they did things like intervening in the market to raise prices on low-cost tickets on transatlantic crossings. But one of the things to say about this is that from like the legislation itself through to these clandestine measures, one of the central issues from a governmental perspective was race. So much of that legislation from the 60s onwards, which was introduced by Labour and Conservative governments, was implicitly about race. So it wasn't stated in the laws themselves, but the aim was to make it more difficult for people who were racialized as other, for people what we might now call people of color, to come to this country. So people were essentially racialized as immigrants on the basis of shifting colonial hierarchies of race. So they were constructed as out of place, as not belonging, even though as people from colonies and former colonies, they had previously been classed as citizens and subjects. So this was justified on two overlapping arguments. One, that certain groups were culturally distinct from British people and thus a threat to British ways of life. and two, that people would undermine the British economy by taking jobs. So these are sort of arguments I think we're quite familiar with in contemporary debates about immigration. So here, I want to pause for a moment and consider how this relates to race, which, as we know, is constructed, and also how this relates to the construction of place, so Britain as a country. It's not only the really key thing when we're talking about race, it's not only that these policies were directed towards people who we would now maybe call people of color, minority ethnic, people who are minority ethnic, but it's that, so that is people who might not be considered phenotypically white. It's that this threat and this very idea is created through racialization. So this is where thinking about race is really useful. So Stuart Hall, the late great cultural theorist, tells us that racism claims to ground the social and cultural differences, in biological differences. So this idea that people's difference is rooted in nature, something that's inherent. So importantly, this is not just about skin color. So we have what he calls biological racism and cultural differentialism. He says constitute not two different systems, but racism's two registers. It therefore, Hall says, seems more appropriate to speak not of racism versus cultural difference, but of racism's two logics. So how more can we think about this? We might say that this is achieved through racialization. So the way that race is injected into social relations and becomes determining and meaning-laden. So it is, as Meera Sabaratnam describes, the process by which supposed ancestral groups of individuals or groups are identified, and then this identification is invested with political meaning. And this is how you can have situations where it is people's supposed cultural difference that makes them a threat to Britain, and people say this isn't to do with race, but actually it is bound up with race. And so there is an assumption of immanence, an idea of inherent qualities within certain groups. Some are inherently threatening to others. Others, like the British, are inherently able to progress. So this relies on an erasure of histories and a world beyond Britain. So when we hear these arguments about British culture, for instance, this notion of British culture is rooted in progress relies on the constructed ignorance of colonial and contemporary histories of extraction that make this progress possible in the first place. So it's not about an innate ability to develop. So this has very real impacts. And this is when we're thinking about racism. It constructs some groups as inherently threatening and then justifies state violence. So here I think Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism is also useful. Racism, she says, specifically is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So this evidently applies to the way people seeking asylum are treated, whether at the border or in Britain. So race is now connected to immigration in complex ways that can be difficult to unpick. And I'm really aware of the time, and I do want to try and get through the bulk of what I wanted to say about asylum. So essentially, the standard argument in some mainstream refugee literature is that restrictive policies were introduced because in places like Britain because more people could travel, because the rise of airfare made it easier, and this meant that people in poverty could travel. So it became really hard to distinguish, the argument goes, between people seeking asylum legitimately and from people who were bogus asylum seekers or economic migrants. So back to thinking about New Labour again, that same slide. So this was a really big theme in the New Labour years, this idea that there are lots of people who are coming to take from the system who aren't legitimate. But really importantly for us, critical work makes this more complex. So as Zeta reminds us, labelling is a process of identification and a mark of identity. It implies something independently applied, but actually is also something that can be chosen and amended. It has tangible and real world meaning, but is also metaphorical and symbolic. So labelling, this idea of is someone an asylum seeker, refugee, economic migrant, it is a concept that shows how political agendas about identity become incorporated in ostensibly neutral bureaucratic categories. So the divides between asylum seeker, refugee, bogus asylum seeker, economic migrant aren't just bureaucratic or descriptive, they're political. And I would argue this is related to how refugees are constructed. This helps define their place in Britain. So for instance, people seeking asylum are constructed as out of place, relatively valueless, and often people who deceive the system through the notion that they're not genuine. and this helps to justify the ways they're treated in the national debate. They're treated as in this place, Britain, which is generous and progressive, and using their place here to take from Britain. But really, they shouldn't be here because they're illegitimate. Their place in social discourse is constructed negatively. So how can we understand the way this relates to race? So B.S. Chimney's work draws on the geopolitical context of the Cold War to suggest that between the 1950s and 1980s, the ideal type asylum seeker was imagined as a white person fleeing communism. What changed then, the argument goes in the more critical literature, was we saw the end of the Soviet Union, and one of my colleagues, Lucy Mablin, who's based at Sheffield as well, argues against this and says that this shift in context is really important. This shift in who is sort of coming to claim asylum is really, really key. So what she argues is that from the 1980s, 1990s onwards, you get more people coming from colonies and from former colonies. And this is what leads to the shift in policies. So asylum seekers, she says, come to be marked as different in line with the narrative of unwanted alien others from the underdeveloped non-modern world. They are then racialized as a threat, racialized also as being deceptive, as deceiving the British state. So here place is important because Britain is seen as a place that is constructed as civilized, but importantly, this civilization is progress, which is inherent to Britishness. So as I've already talked about, that is one of the ways that it's related to race. So is it in this context that people are exposed to immigration debate and the policies that shape and impact their lives? And obviously we do need to look at the specificity of particular moments. So I'm sort of making a general argument here, and I realize some of the issues with that. I do think we need to look at particular moments to see how race is functioning in different ways. This explanation is a bit broad brush, but it does require nuance to look at how different groups are treated at particular times. So I would actually say it's in this context that we can think about the current debates and legislation relating to the channel crossings and the Nationality and Borders Bill and the most recent Rwanda policy related to that. Like, what is going on here? I would say that one of the things that's happening is there is this idea that people, so it goes back to this idea, the people who are coming are not genuine. You hear this sort of phrase illegal immigrant quite a lot, and it's in the public discussion today around what Labour should do. And so there is this idea that people are deceptive, that they are not genuine, and this is all tied to this historical debate, or more recent, this debate in the past 20 years. But there's also a specific thing happening here, I think, with race and gender. So there is a particular focus, particularly with the Rwanda policy, of an idea of young men coming to claim asylum, being lying about this, essentially. And so I would say we have here is race, gender, and religion working together, Islamophobic narratives that actually parts of the European feminism, so this is sort of like across Europe you hear these arguments, are complicit with this idea that namely Muslim men, or men who are perceived to be Muslim, are culturally different from British people, and implicitly then British men, and thus inherent in Islam and in these men is an inability to respect women, a form of patriarchy that is supposedly innate, or that is so difficult to dislodge that these people pose a threat. So they are once lying, but they are also threatening. And this is based on these forms of racialization that I have mentioned. And so because I'm very aware of the time and we have about 2 minutes left, I have, forgotten about my slides because I was so focused on the time. So I mean, these slides just give you an idea of like the division between different groups, and then this idea about, we're all sort of well aware of this discourse around young men. This just kind of demonstrates what I was saying. So I do just want to end by saying, because I did, and I realize I've sort of raced through all of that, but I do think it's really important to end by thinking about this labeling that I mentioned earlier more broadly, the impact of border regimes on people. And I think that means interrogating and concerning ourselves with different categories. There were different ways people are categorized beyond asylum. So including people who are ostensibly economic migrants. And I know there's a lot of literature around the messiness of this categorization, and that it doesn't or the difficulties with this categorization. It doesn't map on to the complexity of when people move. But I think there's also a broader point to make here, which is that if we're thinking about this discussion around place, so as I've mentioned in relation to the asylum debate, like people are constructed out of place, they're not seen to belong, that they should be elsewhere. This isn't only about people seeking asylum. This is about people who are migrants more generally. And this decision I would argue, and we really saw this in the New Labour years, for instance, can be made on the basis of value. If they're seen to contribute, they may be admitted at least for a finite amount of time. If not, then they will not be accepted. And we know that people move for all kinds of different reasons. One, for instance, can be trying to send money back home. And so when we're thinking about mental health and the treatment of human beings, I think this should matter to us too. So not only thinking about asylum and people who are refugees, but people who need to move for all kinds of reasons that maybe don't fall under that slightly narrow definition of who constitutes a refugee. And so essentially what I mean by this is I would caution against the idea of the sort of good refugee and then the bad economic migrant. So whilst it may be necessary to make, and it is necessary to make the arguments for asylum, given everything that the British state and across Europe is being done, that doesn't need to be done on the basis of saying it's okay to exclude this other group, is what I would say. That's the sort of horizon, I guess, to think about. So I'm at time. So I just really briefly to conclude, what I've tried to do in this half an hour is think about different forms of place when trying to make sense of refugee mental health, and importantly, how we got here. So I've attempted to analyse place in the place of current policy in the history of the British history, the place of refugees in social discourse and their physical sort of place, thinking about dispersal, which I mentioned briefly, including thinking about how this relates to the way Britain sees itself as a place, how out of placeness, if you like, is constructed, and ultimately how this is rooted and related to processes of racialization that justify mistreatment. And then I've ended by trying to very briefly say something about place, the hierarchical way we might understand movement and resisting that. But I realize I'm at time, so I will end there and look forward to hearing all your comments, questions, and any thoughts that anyone might have. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maya. This was just fantastic. What a tour de France through the history and up to the present. So just really fantastic. Thank you very much. We have questions coming in and through the Mentimeter. So thank you for all of those. For those of you who are posing them, I'm going to have to select. But what I wanted to say as well is that we are going to share the questions with the presenters, so even the ones that were not asked, because I do think that they can be helpful for sort of further thinking. So thank you very much. And Maya, since you might still have the slides close to hand, there was just one question that asked, the definition of racism captured the essence of racial oppression. Could you please share it again? Thanks. So someone thought that definition was really helpful.
Okay. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So I will just jump into the next question while people can take notes. So we have a question from Helen, who asks, some countries, for example, Uganda, enable refugees to work and enable them to cross borders without evidence as prima facie case due to escaping human rights abuses. Why do you think the UK doesn't do this?
Oh, I mean, very good question. And I mean, I think maybe one of the ways that we could better understand this, so I think my answer would be partial, and maybe you also have an idea. I don't know if anyone has ideas. I'd love to hear, but like from what I can remember when I was doing the research from the book and looking at debates around the time, is like, one, there is a sort of political incentive to appear tough, right? And so there is like an ideological commitment sort of across the political mainstream to make it seem like governments are being tough on refugees. And one part of that is saying, we're not going to allow people to work, we're not going to allow people to move around. But I think there's also this idea of mistrust and this idea of people coming to take from the system. So that the stuff that I talked about earlier around labeling and this idea of bogus asylum seekers, and this being tied with who was coming, it is telling. Lucy Maebelline makes this argument about when these kinds of laws were introduced. And there is this sort of idea that Britain is this generous state. I mean, you have it in Europe as well. People look like countries are generous and take people in. And the way to like weed out the legitimate from the illegitimate is to put people through these very, very difficult processes. And I mean, there isn't another, I think Imogen Tyler is written a book where she connects some of the immigration and asylum discourses up with broader understanding about the welfare state. And so linked to this idea of some certain people being undeserving. So Robbie Shilliam's work on the undeserving poor, I think would take me too long to like formulate make all the connections there. But I think there's something there about the ways that people who are poorer as well in Britain are then being exposed to different kinds of bureaucratic benefits regimes. And so one person I spoke to talked about how sometimes in the same spaces in Britain, you will find people who are trying to seek asylum alongside people who are trying to claim disability allowance, try and navigating these very, very bureaucratic systems. So I think it is this idea of mistrust and people not working for what not deserving what they might be able to access. I think that's like a key thing, but I also think there's a political imperative, or a seeming, I'm not advocating for it, a political belief in being tough and really putting people through the ringer in this way.
Thank you very much. Another, I suppose, broad, complex question. So says, thanks, Maya. How do you think we can address the structural and personal damage of institutional genocide and racism in the UK?
I mean, there are people doing this kind of work, I suppose, at very local, like community level. And so some of the organizations that I've had like the chance to interact with, who are basically doing like almost all the work when it comes to this, do things like ensuring that people can access, like giving advice to people to navigate immigration structures, or giving people space. Like there was a place in London that had to close down because of the pandemic, and I think is hopefully reopening, called Aquaba, which was like a Sunday centre that just provided space for people regardless of what their document, like what their status was. Offered like free English classes, offered like space for children to like play, offered like a space for people to have lunch together. And their sort of ethos is very much solidarity, not charity. It's not that it's some people giving to others, it's everyone creating the space together. And I think that that's one way to think about it, local, like sort of locally rooted level, where I think the change really happens. But I suppose it's also about part of the shift really needs to come from a better understanding of race. So what I talked with this slide, it's not simply thinking about people, is thinking about vulnerability, is thinking this Ruth Wilson Gilmore thing. I think we always should come back to this quote, is about this vulnerability to premature death. When we're talking about racism, we are not only talking about things like microaggressions, we are talking about that too, but we're talking about the construction of racialized difference that means that people are exposed to this premature death. That is what we saw during the pandemic. And I think if we can shift that conversation and understanding, as opposed to just debating if Nigel Farage is racist or whatever the current debate is at the time, to this much more understanding, it really centers people who are marginalized. I think that's one of the key ways. But I think I don't have all the answers on that question, I would say, as well.
Thank you. And connected to this sort of race question, we have a question that asks, race was a concept that was once colonial biological, then rejected and became more of a changing social concept. How do we use racialization without making it an all lives matter product?
I mean, I think we can look at, I mean, I think it's difficult to make sense of and to like make, like I sort of have made a general argument here, but if we're going to look at the way that racialization functions, we do have to look quite specifically at exact debates that we're talking about, or exact policies or exact ways people are being marginalized. And so it's hard to make we can like draw connections, I think, but there's risks. Like in my own work, I know that I like grappled with it a lot. There's risks in like making too many generalizations. And I suppose one of the ways that we can begin to like identify this and think about this is this sort of arguments around culture and cultural difference and tracing that, because I think that is one of the key ways this is articulated in like contemporary Britain, is you still have the biological racism as well, like the legacies of that in all kinds of ways. But I think it wouldn't, I mean, obviously I'm not advocating for an all lives matter kind of approach, but I think that needn't be the route you go down if you're looking at the ways that specific populations are being constructed as a supposed cultural threat. And we see this all the time with Islamophobia at the moment. And that there's a lot written about that. Like, it was called the new racism in the 1970s and 80s by critical scholars. And that was one of the big pivots in the immigration debate. So I think focusing on the specificity as opposed to making generalizations is one way to do that. But yeah, I do think it's tricky in like public debate, at least.
Thank you. And that sort of also touches on a question that was asked, so I'm leaving that to the side, and sort of return to a question around place. So someone asks, I was wondering, how would you, Maya, discuss the issue of place within the UK? Let's say the impacts of arriving in urban contexts, like London, for example.
Yeah, I think that so I think there's sort of two overlapping things to say, and this is very specifically focused on, I mean, maybe this is too specific what the question was asking, but very specifically focused on like recent history in Britain, is you have the introduction of asylum dispersal policies, and the people that I've spoken to, there's sort of two like intertwined things going on. For some people, they would arrive to Britain and they would find community and some sense of like home, and then full sense of place, maybe in a city like London, maybe not. You know, I'm in London at the moment, but I'm from Newcastle. I just want to also Northerner. So they would find that sort of community because maybe other people from the country that they've left have also settled here, and, you know, thinking about diasporic networks. But like going with that, with the dispersal policies, is what the people I've spoken to who are like sent to places like Newcastle, to areas that are often quite poor, is a total out of placeness, because they don't know anyone there, or maybe don't know many people there, don't necessarily have many people from like a similar country, but also they're now exposed to all this kind of vulnerability because of the place that they've been put in, which itself is underinvested in. And then obviously the sort of issue about place in terms of housing, which I didn't even mention, but is a massive issue. So I think it can be like there's a slightly more positive telling, if you like, and then there is this impact of dispersal policies, which the intended impact seems to be to, in part, to like get people to give up. At least that's everyone I spoke to felt that way, or a lot of people I spoke to felt that way.
Thank you, Maya. Maybe I can squeeze in one more question before the break,
yeah,
because I feel like it connects to what you have been discussing and to that last question. So someone asking, do you have a view on the extent to which choice policies, individualization, such as private education, healthcare, housing, contributes to the hostile environment?
Oh, very good question. Contributes to the hostile environment. I really haven't thought about, but I mean, I suppose in a way, thinking about the idea that we are all supposed to take care of ourselves and like be self-sufficient. But then really, actually, I don't know, because really, at least the narrative, and obviously this isn't exactly borne out in the policy, is that the NHS is sort of a collective institution. And so I suppose one of the things is it's not necessarily the individualization argument that plays a role there, but what people say is because we all collectively put into the NHS, only people who are similar, like so British basically, or culturally similar, should be able to take out. So actually the basis I would argue of some of that hostile environment policy around monitor public services is this idea of like, people only have, so maybe it is individualistic as well. People only will believe in and have a stake in an institution like the NHS if they feel like other people who are like them are giving too. And the moment it becomes people who are not like them, they won't believe in it. And so it basically, one of the anti-immigration asylum arguments is based on this idea of like, if you want to protect the NHS, then you have to safeguard against people who are going to take from it. Otherwise, people won't have a stake in it. Obviously, I don't agree with that, but that is, I think that's maybe the way that like individual sense of self and identity, supposedly, which is obviously all constructed and isn't borne out across everyone, play into like the justification for the hostile environment. But yeah, maybe that's one I think I will go away and think a lot about, because I think there's probably more to it than that.
Thank you very much, Maya, and thank you everyone for posing such provocative, interesting questions. Really appreciate it. There are more questions, but we will share them with Maya. Apologies that I didn't get around to ask everything, but really appreciate the engagement. But first of all, thank you again so very much, Maya, for this wonderful talk, Q&A, and just, yeah, being with us, sharing your work. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. No, thanks for all the great questions. I look forward to reading the rest of them. Thanks so much.